There's a moment in every conspiracy story when you can feel the air change, when a simple curiosity turns into something heavier, something no one wants to explain. That moment hit hard in New Mexico in the early 1980s, when one man with a camera, a radio, and a stubborn sense of responsibility stepped into a world he never asked for. His name was Paul Bennewitz, and the trail he followed didn't lead to a single answer. It led to scorched ground in the desert, encrypted signals he wasn't supposed to decode, government agents at his doorstep, and a breakdown so sudden it still makes seasoned researchers uncomfortable to talk about. Did Paul Bennewitz discover something real, or did someone build a reality around him until it destroyed him? There's a quiet confidence that comes from a person who knows their field inside out, and that's exactly the kind of presence Paul Bennewitz carried, long before anyone connected his name to aliens or underground bases. He was a respected physicist who built a company that worked side by side with the same institutions, later accused of hiding the very things he claimed to uncover. He trained as a physicist and was on track for a PhD, which already says plenty, but what really shaped him was the way he approached problems. He enjoyed structure. He liked things that behaved the way physics said they should. This mindset is what made him successful when he founded Thunder Scientific, a company designing high-precision humidity and temperature equipment. This was the kind of tech NASA used, the kind the Air Force trusted, because accuracy was a requirement. When you're dealing with rockets, flight systems, classified environments, you don't take chances. You call people like Paul. That trust didn't come from charm or marketing. It came from results. Paul spent years refining devices until they hit tolerances that most manufacturers couldn't match. People who knew him described him as steady, methodical, the sort of person who checked everything twice, because once wasn't enough. Living near Kirtland Air Force Base wasn't random either. It made business easier. His equipment needed to be tested, calibrated, approved, and often inspected by people working behind those gates. Being close to the base cut down on delays and gave him direct access to the people relying on his work. So he bought a home just across from the perimeter. His workshop sat on the same property, giving him the freedom to test and tinker without commuting anywhere. From his office window, he could see the restricted area of Manzano Weapons Storage Complex, something he barely thought about, because it had always been part of the landscape. Nothing in his life had prepared him for something that broke the rules. He wasn't searching for mysteries. He wasn't poking around restricted zones. His life didn't drift into the strange. The strange drifted into his. And the first crack in the calm came from the sky. The turning point for Paul came quietly, on an ordinary night, when something unusual caught his attention over the Air Force Base. He noticed a light moving across the restricted zone. Not strange on its own. Aircraft fly that path all the time, but this one behaved differently. It didn't follow a flight corridor. It didn't arc or descend the way a plane would. It moved with an abruptness that didn't fit anything he'd ever measured. At first, he assumed it was one of the classified programs Kirtland was known for. The base had always been a testing ground for high-level projects, so when the light accelerated so fast that it looked like it jumped across the sky, Paul didn't panic. He took it as a sign that someone at Kirtland was working on something revolutionary, and as a contractor who worked with them, the idea wasn't unbelievable. If anything, he thought he was witnessing the next stage of aviation tech. But then the light changed colour, a sudden shift from white to blue to red. Almost like a pulse. Still silent, still moving at impossible angles. Paul watched it hover for a moment, then dart sideways in a way that broke every rule of aerodynamics he understood. That's when the curiosity kicked in. His mind didn't jump to aliens, it jumped to data. If the Air Force was testing a new propulsion system, he wanted to record the behaviour. Not for curiosity alone, but because this was the kind of development that could influence future contracts. He grabbed his 8mm camera, the one he used to document equipment test, and started filming. He zoomed in, kept the frame steady, and tracked the object. When it shot upward and vanished, he stayed outside, waiting. Part of him expected it to return. And it did. Not that night, but the next one. And the next. And the next. Within a week, the sightings became a pattern. Always near the same part of the base. Always silent. Always defying movement that made sense. One night, he saw two lights moving together, keeping equal distance, then breaking apart in opposite directions. Another night, a light hovered low to the ground near Manzano, as if scanning the area. He filmed every sighting, filling rolls of film and reviewing them frame by frame. And this is where his concerns shifted. At first, the lights felt like an experimental craft, but the more he filmed, the more the patterns didn't align with anything he recognized from physics or aerospace engineering. These objects moved like they weren't bound by weight or momentum. They behaved more like instruments scanning an area rather than ships flying through it. Paul started logging the timings. He mapped out the locations. He studied the frames for energy signatures and noticed faint patterns. The glow wasn't constant. It pulsed, almost like a modulation. That detail locked into his scientific mind. Something was controlling these movements with precision. But the strangest part wasn't what he saw. It was where he saw it. These objects weren't wandering randomly. They were always near classified zones, always near areas where nuclear materials were stored or tested. And that placed a new question in Paul's head. If these were Air Force projects, why run them so close to nuclear storage? And if they weren't Air Force projects, then someone else was operating inside one of the most secure spaces in the country. The more he filmed, the more his concern grew. If someone was flying unauthorized craft over Kirtland, the Air Force had a serious problem, and Paul felt he had a duty to document it before reporting anything. Night after night, he returned to the window, camera in hand, watching for the lights. At some point, it stopped feeling like an interesting side project and started feeling like an investigation that chose him rather than the other way around. Every new sighting pushed him deeper. Every pattern added weight to the previous one. And the longer he watched, the harder it became to treat this as something harmless. One night, after a particularly strange series of movements, fast dives, pauses, sharp ascents, almost like communication signals, Paul raised a new possibility in his notes. If these aren't ours, then who's controlling them? He didn't attach meaning to that question yet. He simply acknowledged that the data didn't match any known aircraft capabilities. His curiosity was no longer just scientific, it was protective. His company worked with the Air Force. His home sat across from their perimeter. Whatever these lights were doing, they were operating in a space Paul knew well, a space he trusted, a space that, if compromised, could lead to problems far bigger than a few strange lights. And while the lights alone were enough to unsettle him, the real shift came when he went from watching silent objects in the sky to receiving signals, real transmissions from somewhere he couldn't explain. That's when his curiosity turned into a mission, and the mystery pulled him deeper than he ever expected. Paul wasn't chasing mysteries, he was doing what he always did when he needed to clear his head, sitting in his lab late at night, adjusting the tuning knobs on his radio equipment, like a craftsman restoring an old instrument. He had done this for years. High-frequency scanning was muscle memory for him, almost a form of meditation. He'd sweep through bands, check noise floors, compare signal strength, make notes only he could read because the shorthand was entirely his own. This was routine, part of the rhythm of his workday, nothing dramatic about it. But that night, routine cracked. He stopped the sweep because something didn't fit. A sharp burst cut through the noise, not the typical military chatter he'd grown used to hearing around Kirtland. This was a clean spike at gigahertz range, far above anything that should have been broadcasting in the area. Paul leaned forward, listening closely. Another burst, then a pause, then two bursts, then a longer silence, as if the source was thinking before speaking again. He replayed the recording. The pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't random, it was structured. Something or someone was transmitting with intention. Most people might jump to aliens, but Paul didn't have that luxury. His mind went straight to the Air Force, maybe a new encrypted system, maybe a test frequency no one had told him about. And because his company handled high-precision sensors for NASA and the military, he knew what those signals usually looked like. This wasn't that, so he followed his instinct. He documented it. He wrote down timestamps, signal shapes, bursts per second, and peak frequencies. A normal person would have gone to sleep. Paul stayed up until sunrise because the signals didn't stop. They pulsed on and off throughout the night, always in the same band, always in patterns that felt like a language being tapped out in a form he hadn't learned yet. By the next week, the nightly bursts had become familiar. At this point, Paul wasn't curious anymore. He was pulled in, so he added a second receiver, then a third. He synced them to atomic time signals so he could compare transmissions down to microseconds. He built a logging system, that recorded every pulse straight to tape without a single gap. Night after night, the bursts kept coming. Every time he thought the pattern would break, it returned with slight variations, as if the source was adjusting or evolving. He charted these changes. He mapped their frequencies. Before long, his lab wall was covered in diagrams and hand-drawn charts showing clusters that lined up with each other in ways he couldn't ignore. One night, after 6 straight hours of data logging, something changed. The bursts weren't just pulsing anymore, they were stacking. Layered rhythms, overlapping in ways that looked eerily similar to multi-channel communication. And that's when he knew this wasn't interference, it was communication. Now the question wasn't just what is transmitting, it was what is it saying, and that's where the next phase of Paul's obsession began, the decoding. This part of the story changes everything, because this is where Paul stops being an observer and becomes an interpreter. It's one thing to log signals, it's another thing to break into them. He started with the basics of cryptanalysis, the slow, mathematical grind used to decode unknown languages. You start by treating every burst like a letter, then you track how often each letter appears. Languages have fingerprints. Some letters show up more than others. Some clusters follow predictable rules. Paul fed the recordings into his computer and wrote new software to hunt for these fingerprints. The first breakthrough came when his software detected clusters that repeated with clockwork regularity. In human languages, that's usually a sign of common words, the, and, may, to. In communication theory, it's a sign of essential concepts. For Paul, that was enough. So he assigned placeholder meanings to these clusters: object, location, movement, energy, time. These were categories that fit the way the burst behaved. And this is where the story takes a strange turn. The more meaning the software extracted, the darker the tone of the messages became. One cluster, which showed up constantly, mapped to something like resource. Another mapped to loss. When combined, the translations hinted at scarcity, something running out. A different cluster found mostly in long bursts mapped to movement, arrival, or change. And then came the message that froze him. A long burst sequence translated incompletely into something like movement delayed, water critical, species decline accelerating, conflict expected. It wasn't polished English, obviously. It was the closest his software could get by mapping patterns to concepts. But even in rough form, the meaning was disturbing. Paul didn't show this to anyone at first. He didn't even say it out loud. He printed it, stared at it, and sat there in silence because he knew this wasn't the kind of thing you read and forget. Over the next days, more fragments emerged. Station compromised, relocation required. Time shift unstable, observation team incomplete. Paul didn't know if these translations were accurate. He knew the software was built on assumptions. He kept decoding. He couldn't stop. Every new sequence added context to the last, like pieces of a story unfolding in slow motion. And the more he saw, the more convinced he became that the signals weren't abstract puzzles. They were communications from a structured, organized group dealing with serious issues. But the real turning point came when he noticed that some sequences matched the timing of the lights he filmed over Kirtland. It was the first time the two mysteries overlapped in a way he couldn't shrug off. That connection locked Paul into the mystery with no way out. He wasn't translating unknown signals anymore. He was uncovering a conversation happening in his backyard, above a classified military base, between entities he still couldn't define. So there comes a moment in every mystery where curiosity slips into action, and for Paul, that moment arrived on a night that felt no different from the dozens before it. He sat in his lab surrounded by the familiar buzz of machines, the glow of oscilloscopes, the hum of recorders tracking every pulse in the frequency range he'd been studying. He had mapped the signals, catalogued the bursts, broken them down into patterns, and even pushed his software to the limit to extract meaning. But the data was starting to corner him. These signals weren't background chatter, they behaved like exchanges. And nothing bothered him more than an unanswered question. Were these transmissions reacting to anything he did? That's what pushed him to do something he never planned. He decided to send a message back. His decision came from frustration and a desire to ground the mystery in something testable. If the source responded, then he'd know he was dealing with intelligence. If it didn't, then maybe the signals were nothing more than automated chatter bouncing between unknown systems. Either way, he'd have something solid to work with. Paul knew he had to be careful with how he crafted the message. He wanted something simple, something that wouldn't inject meaning but could still be recognized as a structured burst. He chose a sequence that mirrored one of their most common patterns, the cluster his software translated as location. To him, that made sense. And if he was wrong about the translation, at least the structure would still be familiar to whoever or whatever was listening. So he keyed the transmitter, aligned it with the exact gigahertz range he'd been logging for weeks, and sent a short burst of coded pulses. He expected nothing. He actually leaned back in his chair with his quiet confidence that the night would stay silent. But then the reply came in seconds. His recorder captured a burst so similar to his own that for a split moment he thought the transmitter had fed back into the receiver. But the timing didn't line up. The signal strength didn't match. The angle of arrival was off. And not just any response, it followed his exact cluster, then added a sequence he'd been seeing at the end of long transmissions. A sequence he thought meant acknowledged or received. His heart rate jumped. He sent another burst, slightly altered. The reply came again, matching his structure with unnerving precision. There was no randomness in it. Whoever was transmitting had just shown that they were paying attention. The moment that chilled him the most came after he sent his third sequence. This time he included a cluster he believed meant status. When the reply came back, it was longer and more detailed. Movement ongoing, supply delay critical, conflict expected, observation continues. He played it back again, slower this time. The translation wasn't perfect, but the message felt deliberate. It felt directed. His lab felt smaller after that. The equipment that once felt like tools suddenly felt like open windows, and for the first time since the mystery began, Paul realized how little control he actually had. But he didn't stop. He tried to convince himself that this still might be military in nature, a classified experiment, a monitoring system, something unconventional, but human. The military did odd things all the time. Maybe he had stumbled into a frequency he wasn't supposed to hear, and the reply? Maybe it was automated. But when he transmitted a new pattern the following night, the reply changed again. It matched his timing, then shifted into a longer string. His software interpreted as Starship departure delayed, water shortage severe, threat increasing. The weight of it settled on him slowly. If these messages were genuine, then someone out there was dealing with crises he couldn't even imagine. But if they weren't genuine, then someone was interacting with him on purpose, using signals that followed his patterns, responding with uncanny timing, and feeding him fragments that felt like warnings. No version of the truth felt safe, and yet Paul couldn't step away, because now the mystery wasn't just around him, it included him. He had entered the conversation, and something on the other end had responded. The more Paul decoded, the more the story expanded beyond transmissions and replies. The fragments began forming a picture he couldn't ignore, a picture that pulled in politics, military secrecy, and the unspoken tensions of the Cold War. That was when Archuleta Mesa entered the conversation. Paul had flown over that region before during business trips, and he remembered the landscape well. Rugged cliffs, quiet plateaus, long stretches of wilderness where hardly anyone lived. But now, with the decoded fragments in hand, the area didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a missing piece. So he booked a plane, grabbed his camera, loaded radiation sensors into his gear bag, and flew toward Dulce. From the air, the mesa looked ordinary at first glance, but the longer he circled, the stranger it felt. He noticed vents carved into places where no mining or structures were supposed to exist. He saw discoloration on the ground. In some areas, vegetation was dead in precise circular patterns, as if heat or radiation had leached into the soil. And then there were the domes, small, smooth shapes camouflaged against rock, barely visible unless you caught them at a certain angle. They weren't big enough to be buildings. They weren't shaped like storage tanks, but they didn't fit into the landscape either. He photographed everything from multiple angles. Later, when he examined the photos frame by frame, the anomalies became harder to dismiss. Some shots showed faint gridded lines under the surface, almost like reinforced structures buried deep below. Others showed thin trails rising from vents, even though no facility was registered in that area. These weren't signs he expected to find, but they matched too many hints from the decoded transmissions to ignore. The fragments kept piling up. Mentions of station, conflict teams, movement corridors, and something translated loosely as exchange group. Paul started connecting these phrases to the concept of multiple alien factions. Not unified, not harmonious, but involved in a delicate balance that included Earth. And in Paul's mind, it made sense. The Cold War had conditioned people to believe in silent deals, hidden threats and agreements, never acknowledged in public. If governments could hide nuclear installations, chemical labs, and black-budget projects, why not foreign alliances no one would admit to? His software pulled fragments involving growth, samples, and species modification. And when he matched those fragments to anomalies in the area, odd biological waste, abnormal temperature readings, strange lights reported by locals, the picture grew clearer and darker. Paul's investigative trips didn't stop with one flyover. He went back several times, hiking closer, measuring radiation spikes, photographing landing-shaped indentations in the dirt, and documenting anything that hinted at underground activity. Whether his translations were accurate or shaped by his expectations didn't matter to him. The real world around Dulce felt like it matched the story too well to dismiss. And by this point, Paul wasn't dealing with one mystery. He was dealing with several that were starting to merge. The lights, the signals, the responses, the base, and now the possibility that whatever operated beneath Archuleta Mesa wasn't working alone. Up until this point, he's been a private man dealing with a private mystery. Strange signals, decoded messages, unsettling replies. All of it lived inside his tiny home lab and the back of his notebooks. But the moment he walked into Kirtland Air Force Base with his records under his arm, the mystery stopped being his alone. It suddenly belonged to people with badges, locked filing cabinets, and questions they didn't ask unless something mattered. And here's the twist. They didn't laugh him out of the building. They didn't call him crazy or tell him to stop wasting their time. The opposite happened. They sat him down, shut the door, and asked him to start from the beginning. Paul had credibility. He'd flown missions, worked with classified equipment, and spent years around military-grade tech. To the Air Force guys, he was one of them. Someone trained, disciplined, and used to reporting things exactly as they happened. That alone made them pay attention. The meeting room was quiet except for the hum of an overhead projector. Paul laid out his films, photographs, diagrams, and pages full of coordinates. There were frequency logs, timestamps, and even side-by-side comparisons of the messages he received and the transmissions he sent. That's when OSI stepped in. The Office of Special Investigations handled security breaches, classified leaks, espionage threats, the kind of things that made high-ranking officers lose sleep. For them to be called into the room meant someone believed Paul had touched something sensitive. Enter Agent Richard Doty. Doty asked questions that didn't sound like questions at first. He wanted to know when the signals started, how Paul recorded them, how many people knew, and if he'd shared his findings outside the room. He watched Paul carefully, almost waiting to see if the man flinched at the wrong moment. When the meeting ended, Paul expected to be thanked and sent home. Maybe they'd promised to look into it and never contact him again. But that's not what happened. Instead, they took the films, made copies, and then they funded him. The Air Force offered Paul equipment upgrades, access to resources, and quiet permission to continue digging. That alone told Paul something important. They believed him. Or at least they believed the material he had could cause trouble if it leaked uncontrolled. And right when Paul thought he'd finally found an ally inside the system, someone new walked into the picture. Someone who didn't wear a uniform but carried just as much power. That's where the next chapter begins. Moore was already a rising name in UFO circles. He'd co-written The Roswell Incident, one of the most influential books in the field, and he seemed to have a talent for pulling information out of dusty government corners no one else could access. On the surface, he was exactly the kind of person Paul needed, a smart researcher, a respected writer, and someone who genuinely seemed interested in what Paul had uncovered. Moore approached him with excitement, almost admiration, calling Paul's recordings the most important signal data since SETI. And for a man who had been decoding strange transmissions alone in his garage, That kind of validation hit hard. Their first meetings were friendly. Moore asked detailed questions, took careful notes, and listened the way journalists do when they sense a story that could make history. But beneath that friendly exterior, Paul noticed something else. Moore always seemed to know more than he admitted. He'd hint at classified programs, mention unnamed contacts inside intelligence agencies, then smile and change the subject before Paul could push further. Over time, Moore stopped hiding it. He confessed he had sources within the government, people with clearance levels so high their titles didn't appear in official directories. He told Paul he wasn't just a writer collecting stories, he was part of a pipeline. Information moved through him, not around him. Soon the pipeline opened up for Paul. Moore began passing him documents, old memos, briefing papers, Xeroxed pages stamped with top secret markings, and the one that changed everything, the Project Aquarius material. Aquarius was the one that connected everything: crashes, retrieval teams, alien species categories, government treaties, deep underground facilities, and one more thing that hit Paul the hardest: Majestic 12. According to the papers, MJ-12 was the secret committee running the real UFO program in America. Presidents came and went, generals retired, agencies changed names, but MJ-12 stayed in the shadows, making decisions no civilian ever voted on. Every meeting between them pushed Paul deeper. Moore seemed like the one person willing to speak honestly about the hidden side of the UFO mystery. And when someone hands you documents that align perfectly with your own evidence, trust becomes easy. And now, with Dulce on one side and Moore on the other, Paul was surrounded. The signals were playing pieces in someone else's game, and the next stage of that game would hit him harder than anything he'd seen so far. The story takes a sharp turn the moment Paul shifted his focus back to Dulce. Until then, the base was mostly a theory, supported by signals, documents and whispers, passed through men like Dulce and Moore. But when Paul began making fresh aerial passes over Archuleta Mesa, the theories turned into something physical, something he could see with his own eyes. And once he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that the agreement between humans and whatever lived underground had snapped. He flew with the same pattern he always used: wide sweeps, climbing spirals, tight circles over the ridge. But this time the land below didn't look untouched. It looked wounded. As he passed over the mesa, he noticed long black streaks cutting across the ground, straight lines, abrupt angles, patterns that reminded him of weapon tests or exhaust blasts. Clumps of trees were stripped of leaves, and some stood at odd angles as if a strong shockwave had pushed them sideways. The deeper he flew into the region, the more it felt like something big had happened down there. He started carrying a camera with a telephoto lens, snapping photos every few seconds. When he reviewed them at home, the details hit harder. Circles of scorched dirt, perfect enough to suggest landing zones or explosions. Patches of earth where the surface looked melted, and sections of hillside where the trees were flattened, like something wide and heavy blasted through. Then came the shot that changed everything for him. In one of the frames, he caught what looked like the wreckage of an aircraft. Not a full crash site, just fragments scattered across a ravine and brushed over with dirt, as if someone wanted the debris hidden but didn't have time to do a perfect job. Paul zoomed in and thought he saw metallic plates that didn't match the shape of any standard US craft. That idea chased him for days. He went back for more flights, and each time he found new scars in the terrain. Deep trenches that looked freshly dug, pockets of disturbed soil where vents or tunnels could have been buried. Even faint glints of metal that vanished the moment he changed his angle. Slowly, Paul formed a picture in his mind. Whatever cooperation once existed inside that base was collapsing. He became convinced the US military was preparing for conflict with the beings underground, and if there had been a battle, it was happening in the shadows, beneath the mesa, where no one could hear gunfire or see smoke rising. What pushed Paul over the edge was what he decoded. The messages that had once been vague or technical suddenly turned sharp. There were references to losses, aggression, defensive measures, and even a word he translated loosely as betrayal. The transmissions continued shifting. There were mentions of breaches, containment failure, extractions, and phrases that suggested internal conflict within the base. The more he pieced together, the more it sounded like two sides turning on each other. And now, both sides were trying to control whatever was happening underground. All of this pushed him toward a single conclusion. If he didn't warn the public, no one else would. He believed a conflict was happening beneath the mesa, one that could spill outward if something went wrong. And as those worries tightened around him, he didn't retreat into silence. He prepared to act. People inside the UFO community had whispered for years that intelligence agencies ran misinformation games to keep civilians away from classified programs. And when you put Paul in that frame, the pattern hits hard. He was a gifted signal analyst who stumbled into frequencies used for testing advanced aircraft. He had the clearance, the equipment here, and the curiosity to decode things the government didn't want public. If he kept going, he'd eventually expose something they actually cared about, like stealth tech or early prototypes being flown over the Southwest. The easiest way to block someone like that was simple: drown him in stories that looked more exciting than the real truth. That's where Dulce and Moore come in. Years later, both men admitted they fed Paul false documents, briefings about alien treaties, secret underground wars, classified groups like Majestic 12, Starship inventories, abduction statistics. Each file pushed him a little further away from military aircraft and a little deeper into alien politics. Every document widened the gap between what he could verify and what he was encouraged to believe. And the more he swallowed those stories, the more trapped he became, in a world built around his own fears. This slow drip of lies changed Paul's mind in ways he didn't fully understand. He started doubting the people around him. He began reading meaning into every shadow, every sound, every strange car that parked too long in front of his house. He told close friends that the translations he worked on were being altered before he received them. He believed someone inside the Air Force wanted him to see certain messages but not others. And once paranoia got into his system, it didn't let go. His home shifted from a place to relax into a place to defend. He kept weapons staged within arm's reach, rifles behind doors, pistols in drawers, knives tucked between furniture cushions. He placed tape along the edges of his windows and checked it every morning to see if someone had peeled it back. He covered the vents because he thought something was being released into the air at night. He even started sleeping in short bursts, always fully dressed, always ready for a confrontation that never came. His family noticed the shift first. Paul stopped sleeping. Not casually missing a night, completely skipping rest for days. He would sit in the living room with every light on, watching the walls, convinced something was moving just outside his field of vision. His movements became jittery. His speech blurred together. He would start telling a story, stop mid-sentence, and jump to another one as if the first didn't matter anymore. And every new thought wrapped itself around the Dulce base. He said the battles underground were continuing. He said the aliens were desperate and the humans were losing. He said he could hear new signals every time he closed his eyes, updates from the war happening below the mesa. And the worst part was how genuinely afraid he looked while saying it. His family didn't know how to handle this. They tried to calm him. They tried to keep him grounded. But each day brought a new moment that made things worse. One night he tore apart furniture, searching for listening devices. Another night he stood in the yard for hours staring at the sky, convinced he saw movement above the house. At one point, he told his family the people on TV were sending him coded warnings. The final trigger came when he tried to leave the house in the middle of the night, barefoot, holding a weapon, saying he needed to stop the extraction. That moment forced the family to act. They reached out for help and the authorities arrived. He begged them not to take him. And for the first time in weeks, Paul wasn't in his home. He was in a psychiatric facility. Inside, things got worse. Staff recorded him pacing for hours at a time, walking in tight circles like he was trapped somewhere he couldn't escape. He told doctors that aliens were entering the building at night. He said government agents were pretending to be nurses. He spoke in fragments, describing battles beneath the mesa, explosions in narrow hallways, and breaches that he believed were still happening in real time. He pointed to empty corners of the room as if someone stood there. He whispered to people who weren't present. He stopped eating. He refused medication. He lost weight so fast the staff noted it in every report. His eyes stayed wide like he was always listening for something. The decline hit a peak on day 11. Paul became incoherent. His speech turned into fast mumbling. He complained about sharp pains in his head. He told staff the base had fallen. Then he said the war was starting on the surface. Then he stopped talking about the base altogether and began talking about dying. 2 days later, he collapsed. The hospital called the family with a single statement. He'd gone into cardiac arrest and could not be revived. The official cause was listed as heart failure. And for a man who had just spent 13 days in a monitored facility, the lack of clarity felt wrong to everyone who knew him. There were no extended interviews with the doctors, no deeper investigation. Even today, researchers point out the timing. 13 days after he revealed the full scope of his Dulce findings, he was dead. 13 days after warning people that he was being hunted, he was gone. The suddenness of it still hangs over the case, like a shadow no one can push away. Paul's influence didn't end with his death. It expanded. Dulce Base became one of the most recognized locations in conspiracy history, right up there with Area 51 and Wright-Patterson. Researchers still trace the origins of the Dulce myth back to his documents. His photos still show up in presentations. His decoded messages still appear in forums and documentaries. Even people who don't believe the alien part still study his case because the psychological warfare element is too important to ignore. And then there are the whistleblowers, people who continue to reference Paul when talking about underground bases, abductions, or hidden experiments. Some call him a hero, some call him a warning. But no one ignores him. The part that remains unsettling, even now, is how sharply his life changed after intelligence agents started visiting him. Before that, he was stable. After that, he was paranoid, exhausted, overwhelmed, and convinced he was at the center of a secret war. And then he was gone, 13 days after revealing everything. Because in the end, this case leaves you standing at a crossroads with only two choices. Did Paul Bennewitz uncover something he was never meant to see? Or did the truth get built around him until it crushed him?